Through how we might talk about this in slightly more conceptual terms. It's something that people know instinctively, but when you're trying to work within literary studies, you kind of need a slightly more robust vocabulary. And one of the sort of theorists who's been very influential over the last 10 to 15 years when talking about the idea of value is a French theorist called Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu wrote mostly in the kind of mostly 80s and 90s, I guess, as the bulk of his work came out. And he was very concerned, coming from the side of sociology, to understand how exactly people interact with one another, to try to exchange, to understand or examine social processes. He's written a number of landmark works, really. One of the earliest was called Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste. So the idea of value is already sort of there in the title, that it's to do with taste, it's to do with what you like, but what does that say about you as a person, and how do you fit into the way society works? So he's written at great length about setting out his understanding of the implicit rules that determine how people interact. And he's come up with a very influential framework for the social context of cultural endeavour. He's very alert to all of the different things that will filter into the way you understand the world around you. It will be class, education, political ideologies, your understanding of the market, and so on. In particular, he's now most immediately associated with the idea of with field theory, which does not actually mean fields in the agricultural sense. It possibly means more so in a scientific sense. If you think of a field of attraction or a force field, he's saying that people work within a certain context and they will follow certain laws or rules, many of which are implicit. In fact, they're all more implicit than explicit, but they'll govern the way we interact with each other and the kinds of ideas we will have. So he sets out the idea that society as a whole can be seen as a field of class relations. So there are going to be those who have and those who don't have, and they're going to be acting in some sort of relation to one another. Within that, he looks at those who have. They're sort of at the plus charged pole of this force field, and that's the field of power. And this is like a sort of series of Russian dolls, that there are fields within fields within fields. So we have society as a whole, then we have the powerful field within it, and then we have various other subfields depending on what exactly you're looking at. So there will be a political field when you think about politicians and the games that they play and the way they relate to each other. There will be an economic field, which would be primarily bankers and all of the rules of finance that govern how society is organised. And there is indeed also a cultural field, so thinking about the cultural industry that we were talking about with reference to our pictures. You can talk about the cultural field like that. Whatever field you're talking about, he explains that individuals partake in a field based on their understanding of how it works. And he uses specific terminology, which we don't have to go into in any particular detail, but it is useful to just flag up some of the terms. So he says, you have the correct habitus, you sort of have a feel for how that field works, for example. So if you want to be a writer, you have an understanding of what's at stake, and you'll position yourself in a certain way, and you will present yourself in a certain way to fit in. And the way that you're going to make your fortunes within that field is to invest your capital wisely. But he uses these economic terms. It doesn't actually mean necessarily money. He means what it is that you have. So if you were playing a board game, you might just have some counters to your credit. So what is it that you have that you're going to be able to invest in order to do well according to the laws of that field? And doing well might not actually mean getting lots of money in the end. It would in the economics field, for example, but not necessarily in the cultural field. But you have some form of capital which you invest through your actions, and you hope that it will yield high returns. So let me just explain that through an imaginary how you might be an author in the cultural field. In the literary field, I'm getting ever more specific here. So talking specifically about literature, which is kind of high-end cultural product. how can you work according to Bourdieu? What would you do? So if you decide you want to write literature, you've got a certain desire to be seen as, you know, working within a certain intellectual context and attracting a certain kind of person and representing something that carries particular value in our society. So you will probably place your emphasis on the kind of style that you're going to write in, the form you're going to consider. You might want to have a more complex kind of book than just the odd potboiler. You don't necessarily want to be writing Miranda Hart's autobiography, for example, to really go down well in the literary field. So you're going to be trying to use the right sort of habitus, and you're going to be drawing on what Bourdieu calls your cultural capital, the knowledge that you have about literature, that you've acquired through being educated and reading books and being, you know, somebody who understands the laws of that field. So you'll write a suitable piece. You'll manage to liaise with agents or editors or publishers. You need to have some knowledge of how to do that, or you won't get very far in the literary field. And then, probably collectively, you will employ certain techniques to attract a readership. So if you think about books that get sold as literature, they will be accompanied by all sorts of markers that send out a message about this is important literature. It's probably not going to have a picture of a woman putting on lipstick or some such on the front cover, because that sends out the wrong message. It might have an arty sort of bird flying over a telegraph pole in a deserted field, and inside you'll have an author pose. And you know, we can be quite cynical about this, but it is definitely what happens when you're thinking about literature. How does it get out there? What kind of face does it project? That is very much thought through. And as you have success, and obviously there'll be in a way there's a team of people behind that author, often working to actually create this face of the successful literary author. So as you have success, you will hopefully attract prizes, attention, positive reviews in important places, and you will grow what Bourdieu calls your symbolic capital. So you still haven't necessarily got lots and lots of money. Even the most prestigious literary prizes don't really give you that much money compared to what you need to live. They might give you £25,000. It's still not great as a year's earnings, for example. But they will give you capital in other forms, which is the fact that you get mentioned in the New York Times Book Review or the London Review of Books. You may win various prizes where the name is probably more important than the actual amount of money. And you will attract notice. You will be seen as representing the cutting edge of literature if you've done really well. So if the field then, if we stand back, that was my one example of how an author works within this context. The field as a whole has lots of people all trying to play this game, some more successfully than others. And a whole lot of agents and people working behind the scenes to help them project themselves. You'll have a struggle between those who are more successful and those who are less successful. But it's in the nature of literature that there are forever fashions, and new people come in and new people win the prizes, and the old people start to look a bit too established and a bit too, we know what to expect from that sort of author. So we get a constant renewal of who's hot and who's not in the literary field at any one point in time. So thinking a bit more about the idea of value and what this means is that you can end up with certain authors really carrying a whole load of symbolic significance. So I've got a picture here of Thomas Mann. When we're thinking about the German context, Thomas Mann really became a literary celebrity by the definitions of the day in the early to mid 20th century. Came to represent so much more than just the fiction he wrote, although the fiction he wrote had a lot in it already. He also came to represent pretty much Germany from an American perspective. When Mann was in exile in the States for quite a number of years, and he spoke to the Germans who were in Nazi Germany of the time. He represented a certain intellectual figure. He represented good Germany as opposed to bad Germany, as it were, that was in the grip of fascism. And he came to represent more for the world more broadly. He was an important states figure almost for this image of Germany. And it meant that wherever he went, he was going to attract certain celebratory practices and find himself carrying a lot of expectation about his figure and his person, which he interacted with and played with in all sorts of interesting ways, and you can look ever more into that. The second picture is, I just pinched it from the Nobel Prize website. I think it tells quite a telling story of, there's an acute awareness within the industry of all of this. It's not like nobody's noticed that this is the way it works. And they have chosen 5 authors to represent the Nobel Prize. 5 authors who were pretty untypical, or atypical as it happens, because very few women have won the Nobel Prize. But here, 2 out of 5, almost 50%, appear to be Nobel Prize winners. And in fact, I think it's about there have been about 13, I think, 13 or possibly 14 in the 100+ years over which the prize has been awarded. So, and then we also have, we have somebody who is not European in Kenzaburo Ue. Again, not massively representative, because the Nobel Prize is actually very Eurocentric. But what we see in the choice that the committee have made in emphasising those authors is that they realise that they have to represent diversity, because the Nobel Prize is saying something about the relative cultural importance of these authors and what they represent. Because the author becomes the face not just for literature, but also for nations, generations, and ethnicities. So these very highly profiled authors carry a huge amount of importance in all sorts of ways, and the industry has to think a little bit about what messages it's sending out. Let's come back to the Churchill factor of Boris Johnson. Is that a good message to be sending out? Is that how we want literature to be seen? And is that a politician appropriating literature for his own self-serving purposes? And is that appropriate? And that's the sort of thing that something like the Nobel Prize has to think very seriously about. Okay, so that was the conceptual round, the picture round followed by the conceptual round. Now we're going to go sort of back to a picture round again, but thinking about some specific German examples. Does anybody know who this picture is of? No?
Yeah, go on, say it. Yeah.
Hertha Müller, well done. Yes, it is Hertha Müller, but you didn't all go, Hertha Müller, that well-known author. That in itself is interesting. Think about that. So if you were to encounter this picture of a Nobel Prize winning author, just again, for 30 seconds between yourselves, what kind of sense do you think that picture is sending out? What do you think about what this author might stand for?
Yeah, the hair.
Okay, spontaneous thoughts. What we got from this side of the room. Yeah.
She's very serious, powerful, and confident. So she knows, like, in certain circles, she's like very important. And it's like, since the average person doesn't know her, there's something wrong with us and not.
You shouldn't know me.
They don't know me. Yeah.
Okay, so are you getting that from her pose, that she's sitting looking quite like she's in control?
Yes.
Okay, great. Other thoughts? Yeah.
But it seems very, very contrived. Like, if you look at where she's sat, I don't know if this is taken in her house, but I don't know, her interior design doesn't match how she presents herself, so it seems like she's put on those clothes to pretend. I mean, maybe she is a very powerful lady, I'm sure she is. But I don't know if
this
that
is
would
an
be what
official
she
Nobel
wears.
Prize photo, if that helps you, right? So this was actually taken in Sweden, I think.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, so it's in that discourse of power that we just heard that she's being presented as the prize-winning Nobel laureate. Okay. Any more thoughts?
I'm just saying it does seem that she has a very kind of sculpted look. So I like the look on Drive because I think that's sort of like loose thing. But she does evoke quite a sort of autonomous presence. In purely the way that she's kind of dressed in her hair and so on.
Yeah, she's very black, isn't she? I mean, super black, with very black hair and very black clothes and just a smidgen of red lipstick. Possibly also adding to this sense of power dynamic going on. Obviously, intellectuals sort of stereotypically wear black. Roll hair, I didn't think about that. It's kind of blue. So she is definitely playing into the high-end literary persona. So what does she stand for? Well, when she won the Nobel Prize, very few people outside of Germany knew who she was, and not that many people within Germany knew who she was. So it wasn't like she was somebody who'd been touted around for decades as the next Nobel Prize winner. I've just put up a very brief overview of her biography and the kind of things that she has stood for. She has had really a very fascinating life, and one that has not at all been surrounded by glamour or indeed the Western literary industry for most of it. That she was, although German speaking, grew up in Romania in a small, very minority sort of enclave of German people, if you like. And was politically persecuted as a result because the Germans in post-war Romania were not the most popular people, as you can imagine. And she worked in a factory and within the good communist regime where everybody worked with their hands and kind of contributed to the common good. She has gone through all of that and ran into problems with the police from quite an early point because they just suspected her of not being quite like them, because I suppose she wasn't quite like them. As she did eventually leave Romania and got to West Germany in, I think it was 1987-ish, just before the fall of the wall, and she was kind of getting a growing sort of community of readers in Germany at the time, who really prize what marks out her work is, in many ways, its linguistic complexity, that she really probes ideas and identity through language, and she writes very intriguing and sometimes very lyrical pieces that really give the reader pause for thought. But that's quite a niche thing, right? That's not very easily accessible. And therefore she wasn't widely known, and it was sort of an author's author, if you like, in that sense. She was quite cutting edge or avant-garde, if you like to think about how in levels of difficulty. But she increasingly became more mainstream as she won prizes. So from 2002 to 2006 she began to really get, if you like, the stamp of approval from the German industry, and she won a series of quite high-profile prizes. Also won the Impact Award in 1994. That was quite significant for having a bit of a wider representation outside of Germany. And obviously in 2009 then suddenly she won the Nobel Prize. But I suppose the message I'm trying to get across is that she wasn't in a powerful position either in Romania or in Germany, where she was not very well known for most of the time. And her literature wasn't massively accessible. Nevertheless, when she won the Nobel Prize, all of the reporting around Herta Müller kind of focuses in on this. What does she stand for? She stands for the Eastern European experience. And at the time, so it was 20 years since the fall of the wall when she was awarded the Nobel Prize, and this was widely seen as why she was awarded the Nobel Prize. There was no discussion of the literary complexity of her works or the ideas that were in there, and it was very much about, well, this is the Nobel Prize, wanting to raise the profile of a certain sort of author who was a woman and represented the experiences of life behind the curtain, and and the ongoing experiences of that minority. So it was a very political reading of her, and one which made her appear to be much more readily accessible and popular than she really is. And it's interesting to see the visualizations that then followed on, that in all of the reporting around her, people focused on what she looked like. People drew meaning from her hair and from the kinds of shoes she wore, and indeed the clothes that she wore. She always wore black. It wasn't just for that Nobel photo that she appeared wearing black. And it started to turn into, she offers us a vision onto the world. She has a certain vision, and I found the title of this is The Nation, so this is an American news magazine presenting her and turning her into a slightly haunted, slightly kind of eerie looking woman who represents this ghostly, dispossessed Eastern experience. And this was what she was made to represent. It's the value that was given to her, and it's just a very interesting shift in what the author might be about in the literature and the kind of ideas that she can represent. As counter-example, or a very different example of this, is Daniel Kehlmann. Anybody heard of Daniel Kehlmann? Yes, you must be studying him. There was lots of nodding going on from the King's College side of the room. Kehlmann is a sort of German-Austrian writer at home in both worlds, but grew up largely in Austria and Vienna. Here is what he looked like in 2004, not the picture, as you can see, that's 2007, but in 2004, if we think about this idea of cultural capital, the authors have a certain, their counters in the board game, if you like, that they can use to make a name for themselves and represent something. This was what Kehlmann had in 2004. He was born in 1975 to an artistically or culturally aware background, so already good. You're going to do well, you understand the rules of the game quite well, you've probably got some connections. He wrote a number of novels which all went down okay between the years 1997 to 2003. And in 2003 he actually took on the literary industry because he was getting a bit irritated with certain things that had happened to him as an author in the industry, and wrote a satire, Me and Kaminsky, or Ich und Kaminsky, which sold quite well. 30,000 copies is quite a good number of copies to shift if you're working in the niche market of literature. So he completely understood the game. He was very much understood what he was doing and how he might make a name for himself as an author in the German context. In 2005, Die Vermessung der Welt, or Measuring the World, was published, and it was a slightly off-key, unexpected publishing sensation, in as much as the content of the book was not what you would expect to be a bestseller. He was looking at two 18th, 19th century scientists, and he tells the story of how they go about having their discoveries and engaging with ideas of the day. But it was humorous and it just went down a bomb, with the result that it had 35 weeks at the top of the Spiegel bestseller list. This doesn't usually happen to literature. And it was on the back of that translated into over 40 languages. This also doesn't generally happen to German authors. In 2011, obviously it would have sold more since then. It had sold 1.5 million copies in Germany alone, so that's a vast number and quite a few more than the 30,000 of Ich und Kaminsky. So it's an example of how when the industry actually focuses, like the Eye of Mordor in Lord of the Rings, when it focuses on you, your fortunes can be transformed. And this happened to Kehlmann. And just to go back to the picture here, any thoughts on what he looks like in that picture? Anybody thinking Frightened Rabbit? Yes. Doesn't look like he's really quite prepared for the event, does he? And he's obviously just been awarded the Weltliteraturpreis, which is a prize which is given in recognition of the success he's already had. So this is a spiralling effect of literary prizes. This symbolic capital is accumulating very quickly, and he looks a little bit taken aback by it all there. But if you go to his website, now what do you think about him? He had Botox. He certainly had somebody sitting him down and telling him a few basic rules about cameras, and he's got the obligatory black roll neck, I notice, as well. So this is a screenshot of his website from a couple of years ago, and actually his website has changed. It hasn't really changed massively. I just thought it would be worth pointing out that this website, although we're saying this is a professionalization of the author, right? He's obviously realized, okay, I'm going to have to represent something here. He's got people behind him who are saying, you're going to have to represent something here. And he's been marketed accordingly. There is more Daniel Kehlmann in this website from 2013, actually, it was still live, than in his current one, because he is obviously playing with ideas of fame. If you understand German and can read that text, he tells quite a subversive story about what makes an author, where he kind of pokes fun at the idea of authors taking themselves too seriously. And that sort of goes quite nicely with, in dialogue with this picture of him taking himself quite seriously. And you could read that as subversive play. He understands the industry and he's able to poke some fun at it. Also, the audio-video tab had a wonderful click to a wonderful comic strip where he completely mocks the success of Die Vermessung der Welt and how everybody is buying Measuring the World and giving it to other people as presents, and nobody's reading it, but it's selling copy after copy. So again, he's very aware of the being used and having a face, and entering into a more international realm as well, so that his example in this story he tells is Flaubert, so that's French, and some of the books he's collaborated on since. He's actually been collaborating most recently with Jonathan Franzen. So he started to circulate and is very aware of himself circulating within this international literary scene.